Ever heard that saying, don't dip your pen in the company ink? Well, it turns out there's a reason that old adage exists. Studies show that nearly 40% of employees have had a workplace romance at some point.
Really? Wow, it makes you wonder if all those HR seminars about workplace relationships are actually sinking in.
All right, that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Uh-huh.
What happens when office romances go from sweet to a lawsuit?
Oh, yikes.
Specifically, cases where things ended up in court as sexual harassment claims.
Yeah, those are the ones you really don't want to be a part of.
Absolutely, and that's where this research comes in.
Okay.
It's from the journal Management Research, and they analyzed actual U.S. court cases involving sexual harassment.
Interesting.
And get this, the plaintiff and the defendant had a prior romantic relationship.
Oh, wow. So we're talking about situations where things went really wrong.
Yeah, but before we get to the legal nitty-gritty, let's set the stage a bit.
Okay.
We're dealing with two pretty common things here. Workplace romance and sexual harassment.
Right. Two things that probably shouldn't mix.
Exactly, but unfortunately they do.
Well, they do.
Studies show that about 10 million workplace romances start every year in the U.S.
10 million. Wow, that's a lot.
It is. And then on top of that, almost a quarter of women report experiencing sexual harassment at work.
So those two worlds are bound to collide sometime.
Exactly. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, makes sense.
And according to a couple of surveys, about 25% of HR professionals say they've dealt with sexual harassment claims stemming from workplace romances.
So this isn't just some theoretical problem.
Right. This is a real issue companies and employees need to understand.
Absolutely.
Now, this study we're looking at today,
Mm-hmm.
it looked at 51 court cases from 1980 to 2004 where a prior romance was involved.
Okay.
And here's the thing. The researchers found that most of these weren't just brief flings.
Really?
Yeah, the average relationship lasted over a year.
So even a long-term relationship can turn into a legal battle.
It is, and that's pretty unsettling.
It is.
And it gets even more interesting when you look at what the researchers were trying to figure out.
Okay, what's that?
They want to know if judges make their decisions purely on the law,
Makes sense.
or if their judgments are also influenced by ethical factors surrounding the romance itself.
Oh, interesting.
Like whether the romance was extramarital,
Oh, right.
if it violated company policy, or if there were power dynamics at play.
Yeah, those are all tricky situations.
So the researchers had two hypotheses.
Okay.
One said judges stick to the legal facts of the harassment case,
Mm-hmm.
and the other said ethical considerations also play a role in their decision-making.
So they're testing whether judges are wearing their strictly legal hats.
Right, or if they're letting those ethical considerations creep in.
Fascinating.
So what did they find?
Yeah, what did they find?
Well, the results were pretty clear-cut.
Okay.
The first hypothesis, the one about judges focusing solely on legal factors, was supported.
Interesting.
But the second hypothesis, that judges also consider those ethical aspects, was not
So basically, judges are sticking to the letter of the law when it comes to these cases.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Their decisions hinged on things like how severe the harassment was and whether there were witnesses to corroborate the claims.
So those were the factors that really moved the needle.
They did, and that leads us to some really interesting findings and implications.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued.
I think we need to take a quick break first, though.
Sounds good. It's like even if a company had a super strict no dating policy
Right?
and someone got fired for breaking it,
Yeah.
a judge might not even bat an eye at that policy if a harassment case comes up later.
So it really is all about what can be proven in court,
It is, yeah.
not just what feels right or wrong ethically,
Unfortunately, yeah.
which is kind of a wake-up call, don't you think, for both employers and employees?
I think it is, definitely.
Makes you wonder about juries, too.
Oh, how so?
Like, do you think they'd be more likely to consider the ethical side of things?
You know, that's a great question.
Because they're everyday people,
Right.
not bound by legal precedent in the same way.
It's definitely possible.
Like maybe a jury would get caught up in the he said, she said of it all.
Yeah, the drama of a messy office romance.
Exactly, whereas a judge would be more focused on the hard facts of the harassment claim.
Right, the evidence, the witnesses, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
That's really interesting to consider.
It is, and speaking of interesting,
Mm-hmm.
there's another finding from this study that I found really surprising.
Oh, okay, what's that?
Apparently, summary judgments were as likely to favor the plaintiff when a prior romance was involved.
Really? Wow, compared to harassment cases in general. That's
Yeah.
a pretty big difference.
It is. It's like just having that prior romantic relationship makes it harder to win.
Even if the behavior was legally problematic.
Right.
That is counterintuitive.
You would think it would make it easier, right? Like, hey, this person harassed me and we used to date.
Yeah, you'd think that would strengthen your case.
But it seems like it actually weakens it.
It's hard to say for sure why.
Yeah. All right, the researchers didn't really dive into that.
It does raise some interesting questions, though.
Like what?
Well, maybe judges are more likely to see a prior relationship as evidence that the harassment wasn't actually unwelcome.
Oh, interesting.
Or maybe they just see it as something that muddies the waters.
Making it harder to figure out what really happened
Exactly. It just adds this whole other layer of complexity.
to an already complex issue.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, all this talk about judges and juries made me think back to something else the researchers mentioned.
Okay.
They pointed out that almost all the cases they looked at
Yeah.
involved heterosexual relationships.
Oh, right, right.
So it makes you wonder how the courts handle same-sex romance has gone wrong,
That's a great point.
especially with how much the legal and social landscape has changed just in the last few years.
It really has.
Like, power dynamics might be perceived differently in same-sex relationships.
Absolutely. That could definitely impact how those cases are handled.
For sure.
It's fascinating to think about,
It is.
and it's definitely something that needs more research.
I agree there are so many nuances to consider.
For sure.
But overall, it seems like the big takeaway here
Yeah.
is that understanding the law
Uh-huh.
is just as crucial as being aware of company policies,
Oh, absolutely.
especially when it comes to something as potentially messy as workplace romance.
It can be a minefield out there,
It really can.
and knowing your rights can make all the difference.
It really can.
And speaking of things to think about,
Oh, is there something else?
this study we've been discussing,
Yeah.
it focused on summary judgments, remember?
Right. Those happen before a case even goes to trial.
Exactly. So just imagine how these same cases might play out if they actually went before a jury.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
A whole other set of variables.
That's like a whole other layer of complexity on top of everything else we've talked about.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole field so fascinating, you know?
It really does.
There's always more to learn, more to unpack, more to discuss.
Well, I think we've given our listeners plenty to ponder today.
I hope so. I think we have.
If anything, I hope it sparked their curiosity.
Me too. And maybe even prompted them to do a little research of their own.
Hey, a little legal knowledge never hurt anyone.
Especially when it comes to the wild world of workplace romance.
That's for sure.
So with that in mind, maybe we'll leave our listeners with one final thought to chew on.
Ooh, I like it. What is it?
Do you know what your company's policy on workplace romance actually is?
Good question.
And if you do, does it actually hold up in the real world? It might be worth taking a look. Just saying.
Words of wisdom. Until next time, dear listeners, stay informed, stay aware, and maybe think twice before you swipe right on that coworker.
You know, it's interesting to think about how much the legal landscape around all this has changed, even in recent years.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, what might have been okay a decade or two ago could be grounds for a lawsuit today.
Yeah, totally. It makes you realize this area of law is constantly evolving.
Right. What we know now might be totally different in a few years. Exactly, as societal norms change and new legal precedents are set.
So if we had to sum this all up for our listeners, what would you say is the big takeaway from this deep dive?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that company policies are important,
Yeah.
but they don't always tell the whole story.
Right. It's like they're a starting point.
Exactly. It's crucial for both employers and employees to understand the legal side of things, too.
Especially when it comes to these really sensitive issues.
Right, like harassment and workplace romance. Things can get complicated really fast.
So it's not enough to just know your company's rules.
No, you need to know what the law actually says.
And how it's being interpreted by the courts.
Yeah, and that's where things can get tricky.
Because the law isn't always black and white.
Nope, not at all.
Like we saw in this study,
Yeah.
judges really focus on those concrete legal elements.
Right, not so much the ethical or emotional aspects.
So looking at the severity of the harassment,
Uh-huh.
whether there are witnesses,
Right.
and if the behavior was truly unwelcome.
Yeah, those are the factors that matter most in court.
Exactly. So for anyone out there who's ever been involved in a workplace romance,
Or even thinking about starting one.
it's essential to know your rights.
Absolutely. And how to protect yourself.
Things can go south so quickly.
They can, and it's better to be prepared than caught off guard.
So much good info to absorb here.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about.
Any final words of wisdom for our listeners before we wrap things up?
Well, I'd just say don't underestimate the power of knowledge.
It's true.
Familiarize yourself with your company's policies.
Uh-huh.
Stay informed about the law.
Right.
And remember that even if a situation feels ethically iffy,
Yeah,
the law might see it totally differently.
good point.
So it's always better to err on the side of caution.
Couldn't agree more.
Especially with workplace relationships, there's a lot at stake.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into this fascinating and sometimes perilous world.
It's been a journey.
It has. Hopefully our listeners learned a thing or two along the way.
We too.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember,
What's that?
sometimes the best way to protect your heart is to know the law.
Well said. I like that.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.